Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the stockbroker clerked, Lady Frances Carfax disappeared, and Bruce Partington planned, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered what a commissionaire does? Or what a compositor is? Or of the difference between a stevedore and a stoker?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 307, The Boscombe Valley Mystery. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
Bert, are you ready for a mystery?
I'm always ready for a mystery. Like Jack, Doc, and Reggie, I love a mystery.
Ah, perfect. Well, this is an interesting one. We don't usually name our episodes after the stories themselves, but in this case, this was the title of the article or the essay that we are focusing on. This is one of those master's class episodes. We do the third week of every month here in season 6 on Trifles, and this is the penultimate one. We have one more left in December to share, and then we'll be off to a new season in 2023. What delights await you in 2023 in season 7? Well, you'll have to make sure you're subscribed to find out. And you can do that by going to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com or directly to the show notes for this episode, which are found in the podcast app that you may be listening to us in, as well as at ihose.co/trifles307. All lowercase, ihose.co/trifles307. That'll take you directly to our site. There you can comment on things. You can sign up for email updates. If it's more convenient for you to get us through Substack, we do have a Substack as well. Just search for Trifles there. And of course, we do have a Patreon that allows you to get some exclusive merchandise and content that other people don't get. So just sign up at patreon.com/trifles. That'll find us on Trifles. Well, as I said, this is one of those master's class episodes, and we turn to the book Occasionally to Embellish, some writings on Sherlock Holmes by our friend, the late Nicholas Utechin. This is published by Gasogene Books and the Wessex Press and is available from their site. We'll have a link to this book in the show notes. And interestingly enough, many of Nick's contributions in this book come from the Baker Street Journal. They come from the Sherlock Holmes Journal that he edited for decades. But this one comes from the publication of the Northern Musgraves, which was a British Sherlockian society. They had a publication called the Musgrave Papers. And Nick lets us know that David Stewart Davies and Catherine White edited 13 issues of the papers from 1988 to 2000. And this specific 1996 annual edition carried articles by Holmesians on each of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And Nick found himself in the company of Owen Dudley Edwards, Richard Lancelyn Green, Susan Rice, and John Hall, among others. So, Bert, I'm going to turn to you for the introduction to this particular essay called The Boscombe Valley Mystery.
It's a wonderful essay for a number of reasons, but chief among them, at least in my view, is that it's a whole essay built around the question of why do people do what they do? It's a very psychological essay. And that topic of motivation and behavior and what inferences we might draw from the behavior exhibited by the people in this particular case is fundamental to Nick's argument. The other lovely thing, many lovely things, I know I keep reusing this word lovely, but it's a shorthand for things that call out to me that I really admire, is how condensed this paper is. It's very short. And the mechanism, the way he's organized the thoughts and ideas is really lovely. I'd like to just start a second by reminding our listeners what the case is all about. Now, this is June 1889. It's the Boscombe Valley Mystery. It's the fourth of the adventures. Chronologists tend to date a scandal in Bohemia, which was the first one of the adventures, to, let's say, May 1889, although some go as far back as May 1887. But in any case, for the sake of argument, this comes closely on the heels, let's say, of a scandal in Bohemia. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. And in terms of the case, what happens is two people see Charles McCarthy walking from his house to the Boscombe pool. His son James follows very shortly with a gun. They're seen quarreling. The son then, without his gun, without his hat, bloodstained, announces his father's murder. He's now awaiting trial at the assizes. And the assizes are like the superior court, let's say, for counties. And a group of people have retained, unusual word, Lestrade, to look into this. And he's out of his depth. Now, in point of fact, I think Les points this out in his annotations. I think it's mentioned elsewhere. What's going on here is that in England, you could appeal to the chief constable for support from the yard. So that's probably what's meant by retaining Lestrade.
Yes.
And then in the case, there are these lovely things where Holmes contributes comments. You know, he says, nothing is more deceptive than an obvious fact. On the train where he and Watson are going to the scene of the crime, there's this lovely interchange about Watson moving his shaving mirror. All of that. So that's just a quick thumbnail sketch to remind our listeners what's going on in the case of Boscombe Valley.
Yeah, and I think that's a great grounding there. And, this story opens with what has become one of the iconic aphorisms of Sherlock Holmes, that he sends a telegram to Watson. And of course, Watson is living with his wife at this point. This is post-marriage to who we assume would be Mary Morstan. And he sends the come at once if convenient. If inconvenient, come all the same. I mean, that's just classic Sherlock Holmes, right?
Well, it's not really that wording. You know, he actually, and this is one of the things that Nick is going to point out, Holmes uses a different wording. You know, I don't have it immediately in front of me, but it's basically, can you spare a few days?
Oh, that's right.
I'm sorry. He said it's classically exemplified by the come at once if convenient. This one was, yes.
Have you a couple of days to spare?
Right.
Have just been wired from the west of England in connection with the Boscombe Valley tragedy. Shall be glad if you come with me. Air and scenery perfect. Leave Paddington by the 11:15.
Yeah. Now, in fact, you've just hit upon the exact point, because this is one of several points. And remember, I said earlier, why do people do what they do in the observation of behavior? In a world where come if inconvenient, come all the same is a feature of Holmes's communication. wait a minute, this message doesn't sound like Sherlock Holmes. Have you a couple of days to spare? The air and the scenery is perfect. Gee, that's unusual.
And, I don't think it would have hit the contemporary reader of the Boscombe Valley Mystery, because that come at once, if convenient, telegram didn't appear until The Creeping Man, which was late in the canon.
Right.
So, but as we, of course, know what we know of Holmes now, this is not consistent with that kind of, it's obviously more wordy. Holmes had some cash to burn, clearly, with this. But it is a little, the air and scenery, not something that Holmes would have normally remarked upon. And maybe he was just trying to entice Watson.
Yeah. Well, see, that's an important point. And in his essay, Nick doesn't really get into this. But if you imagine, now this is June of 1889. So this is after A Study in Scarlet. This is after Sign of Four. Watson is now married. Holmes is alone back in Baker Street. And this case comes up. But now what happens? He suddenly thinks how good it would be to have Watson with me. And then there's this telegram. And then, as Nick then points out in his essay, a half an hour later, when they're at Paddington, when Watson arrives, Holmes has this somewhat extraordinary statement. He says, Watson, it's really very good of you to come. It makes a considerable difference to me, having someone with me upon whom I can thoroughly rely. And then the next day, Nick points out, the detective will say to Watson, look here, Watson, just sit down in this chair and let me preach to you for a little. I don't quite know what to do. Holmes says I don't know quite what to do, and I should value your advice. And Nick says, what's wrong with Holmes? Why is he wanting Watson to play such a psychologically supporting role?
Yeah, and I think we see echoes of this later in other stories. In Silver Blaze, Holmes says nothing clears up a case so much as stating it to another person. Okay, so when you kind of verbally recount where you are, for your own sake, hearing yourself stated out loud helps you have some clarity. But he also said something about Watson, about not being illuminating himself, but he was a great conductor of light. And he was inspiring. And I don't recall exactly which story that was from, but it's an echo of what we find here, where Holmes, who we're led to believe these few stories into the canon, that Holmes is omniscient and all powerful.
Yeah. Well, and then, what goes on here is this case is very rich, and it's a wonderful story. If our listeners have not reread it lately, now would be a great time, because you get many of the great aphorisms and observations of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes says in this case, singularity is almost invariably a clue. The more featureless and commonplace a crime is, the more difficult it is to bring it home. He says circumstantial evidence is a tricky thing. It may seem to point very straight to one thing, but if you shift your point of view a little, you may find it pointing in an equally uncompromising manner to something different. He says there's nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. He says, my method, it's founded upon the observation of trifles.
Yeah, we love that here.
Yeah. So Holmes, is in very professional form, and he says all this after he goes through all these newspapers in the carriage on the railway station at the outset of the case. But then, there does seem to be a bit of a departure on the part of Sherlock Holmes in his analysis.
Well, we're going to depart for a quick word from our sponsor. And when we come back, we'll see exactly what it is that is un-Holmes-like in the Boscombe Valley Mystery. Stay with us. When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. All right, the atypical Sherlock Holmes coming into view here in the Boscombe Valley Mystery. Let's see. Well, the thing here with Holmes is, as he's stating the case to Watson, he said, the case looks exceedingly grave against the young man, and it's very possible that he is indeed the culprit. Well, this is completely in opposition to what Holmes just told us. I mean, he said circumstantial evidence is a tricky thing. He said nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. As Nick says, this is all quite extraordinary. In one extended conversation with Watson, Holmes says he won't theorize. Then he opines that James McCarthy may well be guilty, and then states with apparent certainty that James McCarthy is telling the truth. My goodness.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Holmes then caps all this by saying, no. They're still on the train now. He says, I shall approach this case from the point of view that what this young man says is true, and we shall see whither the hypothesis will lead us. Hypothesis. He's already made a hypothesis, and yet he can't make bricks without clay, and yet here we go.
Yeah. Well, House of Cards, evidently. And then Nick writes, we have the curious case of Holmes's wit and literary illusions. It carries no fewer than 3, and 2 of the authors are abruptly dragged in to bring conversations to a quick end. And now here is my pocket Petrarch, and not another word shall I say of this case until we are on the scene of action. And then later, and now let us talk about George Meredith, if you please. Nick identifies the third author, Baxter, the original, for whom has been discussed by scholars over the years, There But for the Grace of God, who is movingly adduced by Holmes at the culmination of the story. And one has to ask why Sherlock Holmes appears to be so distraught as to need literary stimulation on 2 occasions in the course of a not-too-difficult investigation.
Yes, exactly right. How unusual that in the midst of all of this, Holmes seems to just want to put the whole thing out of his mind and appears to be distracted. And then there are the characteristics of all of the conversations with Lestrade, which, are fairly typical at some point in terms of his relationship with Lestrade. He has comments like, yes, Lestrade, you do find it very hard to tackle the facts, and moonshine is a brighter thing than fog. And then, in a very passing reference, he refers to Lestrade as an imbecile, which is a bit harsh. And so basically what you've got here, says Nick, is this seems to be a catalog of strange and occasionally contradictory behavior on the part of Sherlock Holmes.
And what could have been at the heart of all of this? What could be causing Holmes to be so all over the place in this? And he says, to summarize, Holmes desperately wants Watson to accompany him on the case. Using unusually florid wording in his telegram, he lays down a number of essential rules for his profession, but chaotically breaks the most important. He is very tough on Lestrade and seems to need the balm of literature and poetry to soothe him. And suddenly, at relatively unimportant moments. So one has to ask oneself if he would have been able to solve the case at all, given his state of mind, if one of the easiest clues in the entire canon had not been offered on a platter, that is, the moving cloak.
Yeah. And so that brings Nick to the answer to the questions that he's posed, which is basically what's going on here? Why is Holmes behaving the way he is? And it's back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of the chronology. June 1889, following closely, depending on the chronologist you look at, with a scandal in Bohemia. So by June 1889, Watson had been away from Baker Street for a year, and Irene Adler had been out of Holmes's life but for 3 months. Holmes was missing Watson's supportive presence even after a year, but even more, says Nick, Holmes was grieving for Irene Adler. What is the Italian poet Petrarch most famous for? His love poetry. And as for George Meredith, Margaret Drabble, the editor of the Oxford Companion to English Literature, specifically highlights the perceptive portrayal of women in his poetic and literary works.
So Holmes's irrational Boscombe behavior, Nick writes, was born out of his enduring love, there can be no other word for it, for Irene Adler. The passage of 3 months had not assuaged his feelings of longing for his lost and unattainable inamorata. And it must have been especially moving for Holmes, even at an emotional distance, to have helped facilitate the love match between McCarthy son and Turner daughter.
Yeah. Well, Nick points out, were there ever proof to be sought of the unbalancing effect of lost love, a yearning for what might have been? Surely, in this case, it is here exposed.
And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Watson, all this fresh air will kill me.